Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global events through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Beit-El. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. This episode sits on the cusp, the last of our regular season before the summer, and the first of our summer season with women authors. There's no one more suited to bridge this gap than Rose Gottemoeller, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, former head negotiator of the START treaties, current professor at Stanford, and a great friend of this podcast. Above all, she is also an author. Her first book, Negotiating the New START Treaty, came out in 2021. And now her second book, Security Through Cooperation, Space, Nuclear Weapons, and US-Russia Relations After the Cold War, has just been issued too. And of course, Rose is here with us. Hi, Rose. Great to see you as ever.
Thank you so much, Ilana. It's wonderful to be here.
Since this is, I think, our third conversation on this podcast, let's not go into who you are so much as what drove you to write both books.
In the first case, I had been the chief negotiator of the New START Treaty in 2009-2010. That involved negotiating with the Russians, but also with the U.S. Senate to get it through the ratification process. And I thought it was an important history to lay out, not only in terms of the politics in the United States and what it took to successfully ratify a treaty in our system, but also to talk about what could happen when you had a good combination of technical expertise and willing political support for negotiation. And that led to the success of the New START treaty negotiations in 2010. The treaty, of course, entering into force in 2011 and going out of force just last February of 2026, with no new treaty in sight. So it's a bit of a hiatus at the moment, but I do think that there is hope for the future. Glad to talk to you and your listeners about that.
Excellent. For those who aren't involved in nuclear issues, just remind us what the New START Treaty is.
Yes, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty was the second of a Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty series. First was so-called START, that entered into force in 1994. The purpose of START was to reduce the forces of the U.S. and Russia by half, from 12,000 deployed warheads, believe it or not, on the two sides, to 6,000 warheads deployed on each side. I said the second treaty was New START. I'm mistaken. It was actually the third, because the Moscow Treaty entered into force in 2002 and cut those numbers again by a half, down to approximately 2,200 on each side. And New START took those warhead deployments even lower, to 1,550 warheads on each side. Still plenty of warheads, in my opinion. We can still negotiate with the Russians on this. But nevertheless, a big difference between 12,000 warheads deployed on each side in 1994 and 1,550 warheads today in 2026.
And is that really the number today? Do we know that for a fact on both sides?
Since the treaty went out of force in February of this year, we have not seen any major changes in deployments on the Russian side. We depend on our so-called national technical means of verification now. These are our own spy satellites, our own radars, our own monitoring systems of various kinds. So we've been watching the Russians very attentively, as I'm sure they're watching us, to see if there are changes in our force posture. But we have not seen anything to indicate a major upswing in Russian numbers so far.
And in U.S. numbers?
And in U.S. numbers, the same, although there's a big debate on the U.S. side, because we're concerned about the modernization that China is undertaking. And our Department of Defense in the United States has been arguing that by 2035, the Chinese could have as many as 1,500 warheads under deployment. I think there's a bit of a stretch in that number, but nevertheless, it is clear the Chinese are building up, and that is a worry to the U.S. And so many in the U.S. say we need to have more numbers to balance both the Russians and the Chinese.
Forgive my asking, as somebody who doesn't understand much about nuclear other than reading Hiroshima and, of course, all of the Hiroshima by John Hershey about what happened there, and of course, other literature around it. But why would you need so many? Clearly, the destruction wrought by nuclear warheads is such that, would you ever get to drop more than 5?
Right. Well, we've gotten to the point of having huge numbers, first because during the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s, both the USSR and the United States thought we would engage in nuclear warfighting, that nuclear weapons were not unlike any other weapon we would use on the battlefield. And so we built up a huge number of nuclear warheads for things like nuclear mines to be placed on the battlefield or short-range nuclear weapon systems of various kinds. And that also led to a buildup in our strategic nuclear forces because we were having some great momentum at that period in building and acquiring nuclear weapons. But it did lead us to what we call the Great Balancing Act with the USSR. What we have undertaken is to deploy equal numbers of warheads and keep them on a high level of alert, so that we have a situation of mutual stability, tenuous, one might argue, but nevertheless, we know if the Russians try to get off a first strike against us and knock out all our warheads, that we could launch on warning of their attack and destroy them. So it's an assured destruction equation, this Great Balancing Act that has kept a tenuous stability over all these years. And so that's why we still have 1,550 warheads deployed on each side, still at high alert levels, with the notion that if the Russians ever tried a first strike, they wouldn't get away with it. Now, as I said, the Chinese building up, perhaps deploying as many warheads as the United States does, then we wonder about two nuclear peers and how we can deter two nuclear peers at once, and whether this might lead to some mischief, some opportunistic ideas in Beijing, for example, that they know we can't really deter them from attacking Taiwan. And so this is a great question at the present moment, whether the United States can cope with two nuclear peers and why some are musing about building up U.S. nuclear warhead deployments. I happen to believe this isn't a simple arithmetic problem and that we can deter the Chinese with fewer numbers, but it is a great debate at the moment.
Clearly. And I mean, again, as vaguely informed, two questions really. 1,150 warheads, wouldn't that just blow up the world, more or less? And my other question would be specifically to Taiwan. It's such a small island in relative terms, if you were to send 1 or 2 nuclear warheads over there, wouldn't it just go out of bounds, really, for the Chinese?
Well, first of all, that's why it's called mutually assured destruction. Certainly the Russian Federation and the United States would be destroyed, but the effects on the global atmosphere, on farming, could lead to a huge drop-off in our ability to grow food because of the effects on the atmosphere. There are all kinds of arguments that there would be great global destruction as well and a great deal of starvation. Some have said the living would envy the dead in that circumstance. So it is a catastrophic situation. That's why we call nuclear weapons an existential threat to humanity and why we have focused so squarely since the worst, darkest days of the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have focused so squarely on trying to reduce and limit them. But at the moment, as I said, we're in a bit of a hiatus, a bit of drift as other things are going on. But I do believe that we'll resume our efforts to control this existential risk going forward. In terms of Taiwan, I understand, from talking to Chinese experts that they don't plan to use nuclear weapons on Taiwan because they say that's Chinese territory and we want to preserve it. But it would be an opportunity for them to use their conventional force posture to invade Taiwan and then to say to us, we dare you. We are balancing you with nuclear weapons. If you try to defend Taiwan, we will attack you with nuclear weapons. So it's more, again, that kind of assured destruction relationship emerging now with China that people are worried about, that it would be an opportunity for them to use their conventional forces to gain their objectives in Taiwan.
So whichever way you look at it, it's rather dire in many, many ways, which wasn't the intention of this conversation, but it is a rather dire prospect. The idea of deterrence would help China take Taiwan and then dare us to do something about it, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yes, it is a worst case scenario, and always policymakers, whether we're talking about Washington or Moscow, London or Beijing, policymakers have to grapple with worst case scenarios, even if there's a less than 1% chance that they could unfold in the way we described them. But that is why it's so preoccupying the experts and the government policymakers in Washington, because they see this Chinese buildup. The Chinese don't tell us why. They don't tell us what their objectives are, and they don't tell us that they're interested in any kind of controls on nuclear weapons. And so we are just worried that they are sprinting to parity, as we say, that they are sprinting to an equal number of deployed warheads with us. And then again, we will have two nuclear peers to deal with, Russia and China.
Rose, first of all, I think I should say what probably most people are thinking as they're listening to you. Thank you very much for negotiating all of this, because without it, we'd still be stuck somewhere with 5,000 nuclear warheads and nobody really caring that much, largely because most people don't know that much about it and understand. I think they care, but I don't think they would know much about it. But let's take a step back to the broader issue of Russia. How do you see the Russian position right now? Because you alluded to the fact that, sort of there's deterrence, but not. It doesn't seem to be doing terribly well in Crimea, though the rest of the line is holding in Ukraine. But its economy is stuttering, to say the least, which I put down to the strategic effect of sanctions, which were meant to happen in the way they are over time, as opposed to an immediate hit. But also, Putin appears to be somewhat unpopular in Russia. How do you see the Russian position currently, and are the war aims remaining the same?
So far, Putin articulates the war aims just the same. He says he wants to take over the entire Donbas, that is, those 4 provinces of Ukraine to the east of the country, and that he wants Ukraine essentially to buckle under to Russian dominance in the region and not to have the wherewithal to defend itself. These are the aims that he says he still wants to accomplish. And certainly, Ukraine should have no relationship with the NATO alliance and should not dream of NATO membership in the future. So these are the demands that Putin has put on the table and has not changed himself. What has changed is the environment around him, and that means, to my mind, that the Ukrainians have done a great job in shifting the momentum to the Ukrainian side, not by battlefield might or large platoons of soldiers and mechanized tanks and equipment being able to fight it out against the Russian army, but by the cleverness of their technological innovations, particularly with regard to drone warfare. And the reason so much of the Russian economy is stuttering right now is the unrelenting Ukrainian drone attacks against Russian infrastructure, not only in Crimea. You're quite right. They have, I think, done a good deal to shut down infrastructure in Crimea that's been vital to resupplying the Russian army for fighting forward in Ukraine. But they have also been attacking targets directly in Russia, particularly gas and oil infrastructure, shutting down Russian refineries as far away as Omsk in Siberia, and going after facilities in Moscow that has brought the war home to Moscow citizens. Putin has been very careful to try to keep his elites on side in Moscow and St. Petersburg by saying, this little special military operation, it has nothing to do with you. It's far, far away. But the Ukrainians have succeeded in bringing the war home to the Russian elites. And I think that is another important reason why Putin's position is becoming more tenuous now. The elites are waking up to the kinds of difficulties Russia is in at the moment, and really to the kind of dead-end alley Russia has gotten itself into thanks to President Putin.
Very well put. We should point out to many people also that you're a fluent Russian speaker, so you're in a position to also understand what Putin and his advisors and mouthpieces are saying, as opposed to a lot of other Western analysts. But taking what you've said just now, I would also mention there was this big article or interview with one of the oligarchs closest to Putin in The Economist lately, which, whilst underlining all of Putin's usual lines, actually seemed to suggest that we should be looking at a post-war development, maybe. I'd also highlight something that wasn't clutched on too much, which I cannot remember whether it was Lavrov or Peskov, the spokesman of the Kremlin, but suggesting that Zelensky and Putin need to talk or something like that, which was the first and only time. So what I'm suggesting is there a softening slightly here of the position, notwithstanding the war going on as it was?
I think, first of all, that the interview in The Economist was perhaps an indicator of trying to get a softer message out. I really see that the individual who was interviewed was a bit of a messenger, perhaps, for I'm not sure for the Kremlin itself, but perhaps for the
Putin.
oligarch
Yeah,
class, wanting to get a message out that they're ready to talk, and maybe the big guy in the Kremlin, is getting more ready to talk. But I will point out that the individual did not mention making any concessions whatsoever or
absolutely.
offering anything up in terms of helping to bring about a peaceful and fair peace in Ukraine, such as offering compensation to the Ukrainians, for example, for the enormous death and destruction that Russia has caused over the last 5 years. So I'm a bit skeptical about the motives in this case, but nevertheless, I think it could be, just as you say, a sign that there is more interest and there's more urgency now, perhaps, in getting to the negotiating table on the Russian side. Putin himself indicates none of that, I would say, flexibility. He stays very hard line on his position and his objectives, but I think those around him are beginning perhaps to push in that direction of some negotiations process.
Do we have any sense at all who Putin talks to?
Very few people, evidently, and it's very interesting to me that this isolation started evidently during the COVID period now 5 years ago, but you may remember those pictures of Putin at this long table with the defense minister or whomever sitting at the end of this long table, and he was quite paranoid, evidently, about getting COVID. So this put him in a situation of isolation where he was really talking to very few people and preoccupied with Russian history, leading him to rationalize the attempt to invade Ukraine and take over that territory, recreating a Slavic heartland made up of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So, yeah, that started now. A long time ago, we have that memory of the COVID period, but it was a strange and difficult period for all, and for Putin, it meant a lot of isolation and I believe a lot of paranoia as well. And so we have a situation where I think that that attitude continues to a certain extent. He has very few advisors whom he welcomes on a regular basis and whom he listens to. So it's difficult to say exactly who are those most important to him, but I will say that they are people, I think, very much from the security services and not necessarily from the broader government community. People like the chairman of the central bank, for example, who has managed to keep the economy afloat. By the way, a woman, Elvira Nabiullina, she's managed to keep the economy afloat. But, who knows whether Putin regularly sees her or not. He doesn't seem to care very much about the crisis in the Russian economy.
No, he doesn't. But on the other hand, it's either him or somebody else who is now. We should mention that in September there will be elections for the Duma, for the Russian parliament, and that apparently, because he is losing popularity, even in such a heavily censored and repressive regime, they've stopped advertising or putting out publicly the his own popularity polls, but also the war popularity polls. And I suspect also sort of pre-election popularity of parties. Not that it matters since only one party is really going to get in, but nonetheless, I think that it appears to be signs that there is, if not distress, then there are problems in the Russian regime and in the Russian perception of what's going on. We're no longer just hunky-dory. We're winning, doesn't matter how many men it takes, because it is affecting the population far more. I've just come back from Ukraine. One of the assumptions that we heard there was that immediately after this dummy election in which his party is sure to win, he will, if you want, escalate by finally calling this a war and not a special operation, and therefore call for conscription. Do you ascribe to that?
I don't really, because we will see, but I think that this is really turning into a missile duel at this point, with each pounding away at the other's infrastructure. Russia, too, putting a lot of pressure on Ukraine in this way, but I will say that they are going after civilian targets and are causing death and destruction in the big cities, in Kyiv, in Kharkiv, and elsewhere, in Odessa, and also putting pressure on Ukrainian grain shipments, trying to close down the Black Sea grain shipments that Ukraine has been successfully able to keep open by very much controlling the lines of communication in the Black Sea. So there is a different kind of targeting strategy, I would say, that's much more violent and not associated with what we call the laws of war, avoiding civilian targets on the Russian side. On the Ukrainian side, they are sending signals to the Russian population, but it is in a way that I think really focuses on critical infrastructure rather than on civilian targets and endangering civilians. But it has had a profound effect on the civilians in Russia, because people are having to sit in long petrol lines and wait to put fuel into their cars. And this is creating a lot of discomfort. I think a lot of the concern and discomfort on the Russian side comes from not only this sense of anxiety about the targeting of Moscow, or targeting. I've heard Russian experts say, well, I'm worried because there are drones flying over my dacha all the time now. So it's those kinds of worries, if you can imagine, on a day in, day out basis, but also, again, having to sit in a long line to gas up your car. That's something that affects people on a really gut level, I would say. And so the Ukrainians have been very successful in that regard. But to come back to your earlier point, the mobilization attempt now 4 years ago was one of the things that really riled people up and led to a lot of brain drain, people fleeing the country, young men fleeing the country. And Putin has hesitated to have a new mobilization, and he's gone to great length to get mercenaries in, North Koreans, Africans, you name it, to take people from the hinterlands. So I think the idea of a new mobilization at this moment, when the public is already feeling very, very perturbed about the war, I think it's a non-starter, in my opinion. He may be foolish enough to try it, but I think that could be a bit of the death knell for his war effort.
That's very, very interesting. I would add to what you're saying is that we've heard that in Crimea itself, a lot of Russians are fleeing, trying to sell their property there, and complaining about drone attacks and not having energy and such things, which, of course, the Ukrainians have been suffering for over 4 years now. So it's a very interesting situation. Let me take you across the border, though, into NATO land. What do you feel about currently the Western response to what's happening, and is it adequate?
I think NATO has actually done a very good job in keeping a focus on Ukraine, and in, together with the European Union, in trying to work together, not only on the military and defense needs of Ukraine. That's been NATO's responsibility, but also on the economic support that Ukraine has needed. That's been where the European Union has been playing the greatest role, and also attempting again to sustain and maintain sanctions against Russia. I know it's getting to be more difficult nowadays. It seems that some large European corporations are very concerned about sanctions hitting their bottom line. And so there are pressures in the EU against further sanctions packages. We'll see where that goes. But thus far, the two big European institutions have really, I think, worked well in tandem. And interestingly, once the Biden administration ended, President Biden, and I give him a lot of support actually, for the fact that I think he was instrumental in keeping Putin from suddenly going nuclear back in the fall of 2022 at a time when the Russian army was losing in Ukraine, and Putin seemed very tempted. The U.S. intelligence agencies at the time were saying he was considering nuclear use on the battlefield in Ukraine, and the intelligence community said 50-50 chance of that. My hair stood on end when I heard that. It appeared in the media eventually, and that's when my hair stood on end. I'm not divulging any secrets here. It was quite a severe moment, and I think President Biden and his team did a great job in turning off that threat, not only by approaching the Kremlin privately, but also by really getting to Xi Jinping in China and Narendra Modi in India and asking them to intervene with Putin, which they did publicly even. Quite a step for the big autocrats to take, to say to each other publicly, don't do that. So it seems to have had a breaking effect on Putin's interest in employing nuclear weapons in this war in Ukraine, so far sustained to this day. But I will also say that it hasn't meant that Putin has turned away from other aspects of this fight, and particularly continuing to throw conventional firepower at Ukraine and continue to try to maintain the battlefield engagement as well, even though the Russians are losing territory at the line of control in Ukraine or making very small gains that often get reversed. So it's a great sacrifice to the Russian army, I would say, even if they are dependent very much on mercenaries.
We should point out at this point that the unofficial Ukrainian estimates, which are very much backed up both by US and especially UK sources, suggest that upwards of 1.4 million Russian troops have been lost in death and wounded. So this is not a minor point. This isn't about, even a few tens of thousands. This is the largest loss of life and wounded since the Second World War in Russia.
It's greater than the Second World War, I understand, and it's extraordinary given the demographic
Absolutely.
sacrifices that the Russians have made. A lot of people, as I noted earlier, have fled the country, and so they've had a brain drain on that account, but also the way they've been chewing up their young men on the battlefield is just exacerbating their problems with demography.
Yes, both sides have, it has to be said, issues with demography, but especially on the Russian side, it is really, really remarkable. Why did you want to write another book about Russia and the START Treaty, given that you'd already written one book? So now that we know a bit more about your understanding of Russia and of the START Treaty, tell us what led to book number 2, really.
Watching Putin through the course of this war blame NATO for the war and for an existential threat to Russia. Putin has a talking point where he says NATO has expanded itself to the very borderlands of Russia and wants to extinguish Russia, wants to destroy Russia. And that was an idea, he puts it, that was there from the very beginning. After the Cold War was over, that was the idea, beginning with President Clinton, that the U.S. and NATO were hell-bent on destroying Russia. That is not how I remember it. I worked for President Clinton in the 1990s, and I recollect very well the views of George H.W. Bush right as the Soviet Union was falling apart. There was a sense of crisis and urgency that we needed to keep the Russians on side, that we needed to keep the Russians from spinning into a completely chaotic state, and that we needed to ensure that their nuclear weapons were kept safe and secure through a very, very difficult period for Russia. And Bill Clinton, from the very outset, said that unless there was a stable security, economic, and political relationship with the Russian Federation, there would not be peace in Eurasia going forward. So he had that basic idea from the very beginning, and President Yeltsin at the time, was the first foreign leader that he really reached out to, and it was the first foreign summit that he undertook off of U.S. soil. He went to Vancouver in April of 1993 to meet Boris Yeltsin there. So it was very much the notion that we need to have a solid, stable relationship with Russia in order to ensure peace in Eurasia. And only later did Bill Clinton come to the idea that NATO should enlarge and should take in a number of other countries. So that's why I became very frustrated listening to Putin, as he has it these days, that this was all about destroying Russia. In fact, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush after him were very keen on ensuring that Russia was at the table with NATO. And George Bush worked very hard to develop a friendly relationship with Putin and make sure that he was at the NATO table. So to me, it's quite remarkable that, at least as Putin is having it, none of this happened. So I wanted to tell that story, and that's the book Security Through Cooperation that just came out this past April.
Absolutely, and we showed it before. The point must necessarily also be, I think, which is missed by so many people about that era specifically, but about many eras of transition such as this one, which is a lot of it is unplanned. Events unfold, and it is up to the decision makers as much as anyone else to try and make sense, to try and bring coherence to events as they're happening. I don't think anybody foresaw the end of the Cold War as it happened. Everybody hoped for the end of the Cold War, but nobody thought somebody would break down the Berlin Wall. I don't think.
Exactly.
I
All
don't
of these
think.
events so sudden.
Exactly. And there was as somebody who was in the Balkans immediately afterwards for quite a few years, I remember working with an Irish diplomat who put it rather well when I asked him once, because he'd been the head of the East European desk in the Irish Foreign Office before coming to the Office of the High Representative. And I asked him, well, why didn't people do more about it when it was breaking out, the war in the Balkans? And he said, Ilana, there was such a mess going on. That just seemed like a pimple on top of a festering sore. And I think that it's a rather graphic but good way to understand this post-war period. That
Exactly. It was chaos all over, very, very much so, and real worries about how to sustain stability, and in my line of work, nuclear stability, and how to ensure that nuclear weapons did not fall into the wrong hands. Don't forget that we had major terrorist attacks at that time, 9/11, 2001 in the United States, and in the Russian Federation, two major terrorist attacks, one on school children in Beslan in North Ossetia,
absolutely.
and the other on a theater in Moscow, right again in the heart of Moscow, where a number of people were killed. And so for both Putin and George W. Bush, there was common cause in this counterterrorism mission. And it's a famous old saw now, but Putin was among the first of the foreign leaders to call George W. Bush and offer him assistance in the case of the 9/11 attack. So they made common cause on counterterrorism, and particularly nuclear counterterrorism. I recount in the book about how closely we worked together. Believe it or not, Putin, the old KGB guy, allowing U.S. experts from our national nuclear laboratories to work with Russian experts from their nuclear laboratories to build better fences around Russian nuclear storage facilities. So it was very much a period of common cause in the fight against nuclear terrorism, and it allowed for a lot of very close cooperation together.
And also, sitting in Brussels, have to bring in the European perspective, though, because the EU played an absolute blinder during this period, because without the EU agreeing to enlargement, which again comes about entirely due to circumstances. You had all of these former republics of the Soviet Union, all of them breaking free, but all of them broke and in one form or another of chaos. And if the EU hadn't have taken them in, there was every chance that maybe they would have gone back to Russia. Maybe they would have done something else. So the hand-in-glove work of the EU and NATO can never be overemphasized in that, the EU brings security and NATO enables defense. And I always explain the difference between the two is that you can only defend what you've secured. You can't do it the other way around. But it is important because also Putin actually hates the EU nearly more than NATO, I think, because it gives the things that he will never provide, which is prosperity and democracy. So
Yes, indeed. And let's not forget that this war in Ukraine began with the so-called Euromaidan period
exactly.
when Putin was watching Ukraine head to the West. And it was the EU cooperation agreement that set him off back in 2011-12, that Ukraine wanted to sign this cooperation agreement with the European Union. And that led to the first invasion of Ukraine and seizure of Crimea in 2014. Oh, you're absolutely right that these things go hand in glove. What's really interesting to me nowadays is that Putin seems to have acquiesced to Ukrainian EU membership. He's made NATO the
Yeah.
bête noire here, but he seems to have acquiesced to EU membership, and that process, I know, has been underway. I know there's a lot of talk about somehow accelerating EU membership for Ukraine. I'll leave that to the EU to figure out, and the Ukrainians, but to me, it's just fascinating how Putin seems to have changed his tune on this particular point.
That I would agree with, but though I would be deeply skeptical that he'll keep to it. But, when we see it, we'll believe it. But coming back to the book, I think I found it really fascinating going back to a period that was so full of both hope, but at the same time, a cascade of events. And at the third time, if one can put it that way, trying to apply the logic of 1945 to 1991, 2, 3, 4, 5, and after that. How did you reconcile that in the book?
For me, it was possible to talk about mutual need during that period. The USSR, as the U.S. was, since you mentioned 1945, the age of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the USSR and U.S. were competing to acquire the bomb, to acquire hydrogen bombs, racing in that nuclear arms race of the 50s and 60s to acquire what was then the high technology of the era. And also in other areas, missile technology was another technology arena that led to the space race, the attempt to get to the moon first in the 1960s. And so the U.S. and USSR were always on the leading edge of science and innovation together. And so we found when the USSR broke apart in the early 90s that there were a lot of things that we'd like to have that they could provide. The U.S., for example, never having engaged in long-duration space flight as the Soviets had done, and we needed some of their technology. We needed their docking technology so that our space shuttle at the time could dock with the nascent space station. There were some really important technological innovations that the Russians had come up with that we needed. So it was an era of mutual need. It wasn't just that the Russians were down on their luck and we exploited them. We needed them. They needed us. And so there was a certain equality there that I think it was very important. And that was different from the 1945 logic of competition. 1945, we were, of course, allies during World War II, but it quickly fell apart after the war was over and the Iron Curtain came down, as was famously described by Winston Churchill. So it's been, a very interesting evolution since that time. And I talk about it in the book. I do say, let's think about the future, not this moment, not this terrible moment of Russian aggression against Ukraine, but the moment in the future when there's a fair outcome for the Ukrainians in this war. They are being compensated for the damage that was caused. There's reconstruction going on, and Russia must participate in that. But then what do we think about cooperation with Russia going forward? Are we going to wall them off and defend against them permanently? Or do we want to think about a future of cooperation with Russia again? My answer to that question was yes. But then I really had to query that answer because I don't see the same mutual presence on the leading edge of science and innovation as we saw in the 1990s. Russia is lagging behind, and our main science and innovation competitor now is China. So how do
Absolutely.
we think about cooperation with Russia going forward? And that's the gist of my conclusions. It's a tough calculation. I still think it's important to cooperate.
I think it has to be different, but of course, you know so much more. As we're coming towards the end, I think anybody would want me to ask, given your huge expertise on Russia, what twisted Putin? What made him do the about face? Why did it all go horribly wrong?
Yes, I have to, in some sense, smile about it because I very much remember the Rome summit of NATO in 2002. And there's a great summit picture, the summit family photo, and there's Vladimir Putin standing right next to George W. Bush, if you can believe that. And that was the summit at which the NATO-Russia Council was launched and at which the Rome Declaration was signed that really put in place 15 years of very intense cooperation between NATO and Russia, very pragmatic cooperation on things like combating drug trafficking out of Afghanistan and working on an airspace initiative for Europe. If you can imagine a common airspace initiative nowadays when drones are flying hither and yon, some of them coming from Russia toward the NATO skies. So it was quite a different period. And what went wrong is precisely what I grapple with in the most difficult part of the book for me to write. And in the end of the day, I think it was a combination of domestic factors, his concern about political competition arising from the oligarch class, people like Khodorkovsky, for example, and partially from these external factors, his recognition that things were going wrong from his perspective of ever putting together a Slavic heartland, and that the countries surrounding him were spinning off in other directions, particularly Ukraine. And so there were a lot of factors there that were affecting his thinking, but in the end of the day, I think a lot of it had to do with resentment that he did not get the same place at the top table that he envisioned for himself. He was not accorded the same degree of regard and respect, and probably never got the idea that the United States was going to be the prima inter pares, the first among equals, and that NATO leaders and the G7 leaders, G8 leaders, remember it was the G8 for a while with Russia very much at that table, but I don't think he was ready for the idea that the U.S. would always be taking the first among equals role.
So it was all about him.
In many ways, yes, that's what autocrats are all about, right? It's all about them. They're very focused on themselves.
How depressing. But at least we had the huge opportunity to focus on you and on your wonderful new book. Thank you so much, Rose.
And my pleasure, Alana. Thank you.
Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word of this episode to friends, colleagues, enemies, family, and anyone you think would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram as @WomenLeadersPodcast and on ELN, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All information and links mentioned in the episode can be found in the notes, especially Rose's book. I'm Ilana Beit-El, together with my friend and producer Florence Ferrando, and we'll be back very soon with another great conversation.